Hello, my name is Nicholas Parker. So I'm going to talk about violent video games. Violent video games recently have been of debate about whether or not they actually encourage violence, and I'm going to talk to you about why. And so do you know that 97% of teens between the age of 12 and 17 play video games in general? And these are girls and boys, and you know about this other fact. So there's a poll that averaged the polls of 10 popular sites, including USA Today, Ranker, Polygon, Thrillist, The Verge, Make Use Of, Business Insider, Statista, The Vulture, and Time. And the top 10 from each of these sites, 8 out of 10 times was a violent video game. So let's dive into some of the history behind violent video games and kind of how they've progressed. So the definition of a violent video game I got from rwfj.org that says that the California law defines a violent video game as a video game in which the range of options available to a player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being. There's 3 games here. The very first violent video game was the top, which is called Death Race. As you can see, it's running somebody over multiple times. It's supposed to be like a car that runs over gremlins. Procon.org actually says that the original name for this game was pedestrian, because you're running over pedestrians. But there was a riot that happened, and most of the arcades of this are all destroyed because people didn't like the game because it was violent, and so they had violence. But let's fast forward about to 1993, where these 2 games come into play. So Mortal Kombat, and it's spelled with a K, so you know it's going to be kind of crazy. Mortal Kombat is a game where it's a player versus a player, and you're trying to kill the other person. And at the end, you get like fatality, where you cut someone in half, or you stab their eye or something. So obviously that violates or that goes into the definition. And then Night Trap. So Night Trap is where you're like surveillance. You're a secret spy that's watching over these 2 girls at their house, and you're trying to defend them from unknown enemies. And if the enemies get to the 2 girls, then something bad happens, which tends to be something along the lines of a sexual assault. So that's where that game violates that code. And so when these 2 were premiered in 1993, the public kind of was outraged by it, and the U.S. Supreme Court finally stepped in, and they said that the gaming community had to come up with some kind of rating system. Otherwise, you can just kiss gaming goodbye. And so they came up with the ESRB, which is Entertainment Software Rating Board. And that's where these lovely letters come into play, and where they actually came from. You got the everyone 10 plus, teen. Mature is where most of the violent video games actually come from. Adults only, but I've never really seen those. And then the RP, rating pending, I've seen quite a few of those. Here is some crime rate. So do violent video games actually correspond with violence? 1993 is right about this area where this peak happens, and that's where Mortal Kombat and Night Trap came out. and they said that those games were calling for violence and that they should be done with. Problem is, violent crime in youth between the ages of 12 and 17 years old has been, it's like that effect where Kung Fu Panda, where Po gets kicked down those stairs and he just keeps falling, and all of a sudden he hits that little like step and flies up a little bit and then keeps dropping. There wasn't really much evidence for people to go off of when they saw these graphs. I got this from Huffington Post, and they said that they don't like violent video games and they don't encourage people to play them, but this was one of the facts that they just couldn't look away from. On the right side, that comes from the ESA, Entertainment Software Association, which is the big brother of ESRB, and it shows the sales of video games compared to the violent crime offenses, and the violent crime has actually been dropping at a steady rate. I mean, you can definitely see that from here, but sales have been going up, which is counter what people are saying about violent video games encouraging violence. And so I think personally that maybe there is a correlation. The more sales, the less violence. So if violent video games aren't encouraging violence, then what are they actually doing for you? And this lady here, she's from the University of Rochester. She's a cognitive scientist, Dr. Daphne Beverly. She appeared on TED Talk, which I recommend watching that, where she talked about how playing video games actually can bring significant improvements in your eyesight, and more specifically, games like first-person shooters, FPS games. So, games like Modern Warfare that I grew up with, or lately like Call of Duty, you got Battlefront, things like that are violent. They got guns, but they're actually they're increasing. She said, later on, she had said that they're increasing your multitasking abilities. They're increasing when you drive at night or even drive in the fog. Gamers more often than not are able to actually see cars through the fog, and they adjust their speeding much better than somebody who's not a gamer. And the only downfall is that if you play too much, because they're suggesting like 10 hours a week or 10 hours every 2 weeks, they're not suggesting you play 10 hours a night, because that would defeat the purpose of gaming. But gaming is supposed to be more of an outlet of where you put your emotions, like your anger, your aggression. You're not gaining anger and aggression from the game. You're actually putting it in so that afterwards you feel good. You don't feel like you want to go blow something up. So is it a myth? So Christopher J. Ferguson, a professor of psychology at Stenson University, has been studying this for 15 years. And through the 15 years, he's also been gaining knowledge from decades before, since 1976. He's been gaining information about violent video games, and he's found that there is no solid proof that any violence corresponds with violent video games. And he's one of the main testimonies that was used in the U.S. Supreme Court when they ruled in 2017 that there was no proof that violent video games incite any sort of aggression or violence, and therefore lawmakers and the media should put this myth aside. So the U.S. Supreme Court called this a myth, and so far it has not been debunked. Maybe the Mythbusters should try to solve it, but yes. So according to the U.S. Supreme Court and to multiple scientists, there is no correlation between violence and violent video games. So, of the many researchers, Bavelier, she has actually just been researching how to make games where they focus on certain parts of your mind to, for instance, your eyes, helping to, she's figured out one way of increasing your eyesight so that like when you're 80, you don't have to get a magnifying glass and start looking at the prescription bottle. You'll be able to just hold it in your hand and see it. She's actually made it so there's one procedure where she does with a game where it lasts 2 years and you're able to have your full eyesight. And younger people, usually like around 20 years old, she was able to make it so their eyesight was even better than before for about a couple months with a game she's been testing with. Now, if we're able to make games like that in the future where they are able to increase memory, where you're able to remember something like 10 years ago that you, like maybe you're like eating crowns, but you were supposed to be listening to your teacher or something, like, I mean, maybe one kid that was licking the window, I don't know. But you're able to remember every detail of what was happening, almost like it was a photo or like you saved a video. Things like that. Your muscle memory, people with muscle deterioration, they'll be able to start with getting their muscle back or even being able to prevent that from happening in the first place, just with games. So imagine being able to use this kind of game in this fashion as medicine, rather than something that's just going to destroy us and be used as a scapegoat for like mass shootings. And so I think if we do use this tool, we'll be able to make this world a better place. Thank you.